I'm David Brent Johnson, the WFIU Jazz Director, and I am here with Todd Gould, who is the producer and writer of the documentary, The Music Makers of Gennett Records, which is premiered this evening on WTIU, and also Dr. Tyron Cooper, who is the director of the Archives of African American Music and Culture at Indiana University, three-time Emmy Award winner, and he is also on the faculty here at Indiana University, and he did the music for the Music Makers of Gennett Records, which seems like a pretty awesome responsibility to undertake, and I guess that's what I want to start out about asking to both you, Todd, and to you, Tyron, is Gennett Records encompassed a very, very diverse catalog of music. How did you approach writing the background music that was used in the documentary?
Well, I mean, first I'll just say, I know musically, I have a certain appreciation for the history, but I needed sort of the sensitivity of a musician and someone who also knew the history well. And Tyron was so not only just talented, obviously as an Emmy Award winner, and also as a celebrated musician himself. So I wanted to have him come in on that musically, but to come in as music supervisor on the project was really key because he had such a sensitivity to the music. I mean, what was your thought when we first started talking? Why did you think that the Gennett story was such an important story?
Well, I thought the Gennett story was significant because it really is the sound of America in terms of the roots of popular music as it emerged within the industry context, which is sound recording, right? And so when you were telling me the story initially, I'm like, man, this is all of the stuff that kind of I grew up with. So say for instance, if you have kids here who like Kendrick Lamar, well then you should love this stuff. Mm-hmm. If you like Ricky Skaggs, you should love this stuff. If you like, so it goes on and on, depending on whatever popular music genre you're into. This is the origins for that popular music genre, right, essentially in the music industry.
Yeah, indeed, and I think I was telling a reporter the other day about that a lot of people when they take their their devices and they'll put a Beyonce song on and they can't imagine that the roots of that music came out of the music of Thomas A. Dorsey's gospel or Charlie Patton's blues, but those rhythms, those sounds. I mean, Ricky Skaggs does a great job in the documentary talking a lot about those old country ballads that were being played in the Appalachian Mountains were the songs that were then influencing Bill Haley and the Comets and Rock Around the Clock, or Elvis Presley, and some of these, obviously Elvis did, Peace in the Valley, and some of those as really popular songs too. But that all goes right back to those Gennett roots, right? Which was coming right out of Richmond, Indiana, which is amazing.
Yeah, and I think when you think about it culturally, you are really maximizing on the American experience. When you think about people from the country, the Appalachian folk, the hillbilly, the bluegrass music. I mean, these are monumental cultural expressions that you have actually documented, and it's all in one. It's like a one-stop shop. I want to just commend you on this project because this is really, in all seriousness, really is a one-stop shop for those who want to be educated about the roots of American popular music. And so you should be, tipping your hat, man. This is just a wonderful project.
How did Gennett end up recording such a diverse amount of music? How did they end up recording Hopi Indian chants and Polish music, klezmer music, jazz, hillbilly music, blues, gospel? Yeah. I mean, pretty much everything. How did that come about?
Right. Well, it's an interesting story because here the top recording studios, the one or two other major recording studios at the time were recording opera and classical, maybe some Tin Pan Alley music, that sort of thing, coming off of Broadway, but nobody was recording this truly American music, this American roots music that was coming out of there. So Gennett just went out and just sort of recorded everything else in hopes of finding additional markets, right? So Charlie Dahan in the documentary has this great line. He says, the only color Gennett cared about was green. So it's like it didn't matter whether the artist was black or white or Hopi Indian or what it was. It was whatever we could sell and how we could market it and do it effectively and try to get to different markets. So it was purely the sound of money that was attracting Gennett Studios.
Right. You have a really interesting segment in the documentary on Gennett recording the Ku Klux Klan as well. And because they were so powerful in the 1920s in Indiana. And I'm curious, how Tyron, did you approach the scoring for that particular segment? Because that seems a little different from the rest of what you guys were trying to cover in the Gennett documentary.
Right, and you were telling me in particular about, you got to think about the context with which Louis Armstrong and Joe King Oliver were recording at the same time.
Right.
The Klan rallies were happening in Richmond at the same time.
Yep. So when you think, everybody talks about, chimes, blues, and what Louis was doing. Think about musically, Louis was just showing us that one of the things that he had was the consciousness about the harmonic palette of jazz, where he outlining melodically the harmonic progressions. Okay, so we get that. We get the musical context. But the historical context, when they're recording in a place, in a space, Richmond, Indiana in the 1920s,
Right.
a highly racialized place
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
with the Ku Klux Klan at its height. In Indiana, and so in Richmond, and so to come to Indiana from Chicago as an African American man in the 1920s, what does that look like? What does that feel like? What's the sensitivity? What are they going through? What do they have to negotiate psychologically to come in this space? And so when I listen to them play, I'm thinking about all of it, and then at the same time, they're creating these monuments. They're actually pushing the music forward. When you think about what Louis is doing, but pushing it forward in a context that is actually pushing against them,
Right.
Racially. And so it's really, I think when you think about it that way, you realize the magnitude of the significance of this moment. Not only that it documents a sound, but it documents a consciousness in a historical moment that's really significant in American framework.
Well, you also have one of the very first racially integrated studio encounters when Jelly Roll Morton records at Gennett with the New Orleans Rhythm Kings, and that's seems to me like a pretty significant moment, not just in Gennett history, but in jazz history.
That says a lot about, I think, the artists and the attitude that the musicians had versus what society was telling them, right? In other segments where they talk about Bix Beiderbecke and Hoagie Carmichael wanting to learn from Louis Armstrong and Joe King Oliver, and so that you can't imagine a black intellectual coming in and teaching white students at Yale or Harvard at that particular time. And yet these musicians looked way past that and said, no, what these guys are doing musically is historic and significant and will influence, like you said, it's modernity, that's being pushed out there against all of the social forces that are coming against it, and for the white musicians to say these guys are the ones that are on the cutting edge, and if we want to be the best that we can be, we want to perform with these guys, and that is just so not what people were thinking in typical Indiana society at that particular point in time.
Yeah, definitely. You talked to a lot of, Tyron was a part of the documentary as well. You were in there talking about the significance of Gennett. You also got people like Ricky Skaggs and Wynton Marsalis to talk about it. And I'm curious how, and I know they talk a little bit about this in the documentary, but what kind of effect has the Gennett legacy had on them Also, how did you get them to talk to you? Because they're busy people, I'm sure.
Sure, but I will say, first of all, it wasn't like we just got these people by accident. These are people who really knew the history well. I knew that Marcellus knew that early jazz history and the significance of those early Armstrong, Oliver recordings, those early Bix Beiderbecke recordings,
Right.
and knew that Gennett was the jumping off place, was the spark for all of that.
Right.
And the same, I knew Skaggs knew all that early rich history of the Appalachian country ballads that were coming out of there. So yeah, they knew a lot, but they understood that history needed to be preserved in a way that modern audiences could appreciate. So, you as a modern musician, you have this sense of the importance of that. And I'm just kind of interested, as you were kind of creating the score, we were sitting in the studio together. What were the kinds of things that were going through your head? So I'd say, okay, we need a hillbilly cut, or we need a country ballad, or we need blues from the Mississippi Delta. What was kind of going through your head when you were creating that? Historically, musically?
Yeah. Well, really, when I think about creating the score, I harken back, if you can believe this, to my early childhood. Growing up actually in the black church, particularly a denomination called the Church of God in Christ, a highly artistic denomination where we played the blues, we played jazz, and all of this was under the heading of black religious music, particularly gospel music, and all of these styles were there, even country, So I was born in Florence, South Carolina, so I'm a Southern man, So I get all of the Southern roots. I was raised in South Florida, so we kind of got this, in an honest and organic way in terms of the sounds that were infiltrating my environment, and so it was a case where I would harken back to my early upbringing, but also as a scholar, understanding the historical significance of this music and the emergence of this music and how it impacts upon the present. And so I can hear right now the blues of Charlie Patton in hip hop and neo soul and I can hear the blues of Charlie Patton, of course, in rock and the Rolling Stones and all the cats that they impacted. So I thought about a lot of that. How did this thing really impact me and also the broader society, the broader framework of American popular music? And so I just created with that in mind, and also telling the story of the people, the community. Who are these people? I'm an ethnomusicologist by trade as well, so I'm interested in the cultural aspect of musical sound, music creativity. Why did they do what they did, and how did that come about?
We are on Facebook Live, so if you want to submit questions to us, you can do that. We have a question actually for you, Todd. I'm not sitting here looking at my phone while you guys are talking.
Are you reading your emails?
You're
texting
I'm receiving text questions here from people
Very
who are
good.
watching.
Okay.
And Elizabeth Searles has a question for you, Todd, and says,
Hi, Elizabeth.
If you could have included one more music maker, who would it be?
Oh my. Well, there were some other opportunities. But with other really top musicians that loved this history. Harry Connick Jr. was one of them. His agent contacted us and was very supportive of the project and was excited to hear. But he's an old New Orleans jazz musician himself, and understood that rich history that was coming from the Marcellus family certainly, but all the generations before that. So I think that would have been a fun interview to do. Certainly other blues greats. I think about some of the great Chicago bluesmen that are playing now and have played for years. I think would have been fun.
I wonder if Elizabeth meant, though, maybe she did mean that, but I wonder if she meant a Gennett artist from the 20s or early 30s that you wish you could have included that you didn't.
Well, I think overall, I think we hit sort of the high points I thought were really effective. There were certainly some other really interesting musicians that were sort of like the next generation, sort of like a Coleman Hawkins or something like that, that took some of those early recordings and then used it in sort of more modern what we kind of come to understand as more modern jazz and some of those things. So you could see sort of the next step up and the next step up and things like that would have been interesting to hear. And a lot of those musicians recorded with Gennett in the later years. So something like that would have been really fun to sort of focus or do a little historical.
But there wasn't
story.
anybody who actually recorded for Gennett that you had to leave out that you wish you could have included?
Oh my! Well, I mean, I'm going to get in trouble here because I'm sure that you know there are going to be Gennett scholars out there and people who are going to have their favorite band, right? And they're going to say you didn't put this band in or you didn't put this artist in, and but you know, I guess the main goal was we really wanted to try to maybe focus a little bit more on some different ethnic music that was coming out of Gennett and some of those artists that came out of there. You know, I think an enhanced segment on Gene Autry, you know, would have been fun to do. Autry, you know, obviously got his start with Gennett. He, you know, funny enough, you know, he got turned down by the New York recording labels and ended up coming to Gennett on his way home to Oklahoma with sort of, you know, in all dejected because he'd been turned down by the New York studios, decided to stop in at Gennett and signed a contract and recorded 50 sides and became Gene Autry, you know. So you know, the singing cowboy and went on to great movie fame as well as music fame. So I think something even more enhanced on that. I think we barely touched on it, and we tried to touch on some of those things, but it was so difficult, you know, in the short amount of time we had to focus on
Sure,
it.
because it ended up being a 90-minute documentary, right? So that seems like a lot of time, but actually trying to tell a story like Gennett, it ends up not being all that much. If you're following this on Facebook Live, you can send us questions. They will be texted to me, and I can pass them along to our guest here, Todd Gould, the producer and director of the new documentary, The Music Makers of Gennett Records, and Dr. Tyron Cooper, the 3-time Emmy Award winner and director of the Archives of African American Music and Culture here at IU, who wrote all of the music that's used that's not the original Gennett music itself. In the documentary. Now, there's a DVD and a Blu-ray edition of this that we are offering as a thank you gift during WTIU's Fund Drive, where you were able to put a few extra things on, right, that weren't in the final version.
Right, and you'll even see little bits and pieces in there where you'll see the creative process where I come to Tyron in studio, and you know, and all that additional music that comes out, whether it's the texture of the blues rhythms there at Dockery Plantation, or whether it's the gospel melodies that are coming through in the organ that he's playing with all the harmonies. I mean, that's all him. I mean, that's all him. I mean, it's not a chorus of people. It's not a bunch of musicians sitting in the studio. It's all him on multi-track doing all different kinds of really fascinating, powerful harmonies that really help sort of underscore that whole texture of the different musical styles that Gennett was putting out. I mean, I was so pleasantly surprised and was becoming an audience member myself, sitting in studio working with you when you know you would jump from a hillbilly song to a gospel, you know, How Great Thou Art, or you know, the kind of thing, or and then jump to you know, a jazz beat, you know. So I mean, like, your ability to sort of jump to all these genres, I mean, is reflective of that history and also reflective of your talents. But I mean, you know, I like to brag on you a lot with that. But I mean, it is. I mean, you know, you were going through. You were actually looking at some of the photos that I had that it would say these are the people that were in the Delta at the time. These were the people that were at Dockery. I mean, you remember you were showing me. I was showing you some of those photos.
Yeah.
I mean, what was kind of going through your head when you were like, you know, you start up that music, you know?
Well, again, a lot of it is just understanding the historical context of these musical genres, and so, and then of course, you know, I studied a lot of this music formally. You know, we talked earlier before we started, I was in David Baker's professor, the late professor,
Right.
the late great Professor
yes,
David Baker's band back in the 90s. And one of the things that I admired about him is that he could tell you about Charlie Parker while at the same time talking about Wagner, right? It was just that crossing the boundaries artistically. And so I learned to think that way, where I could identify the cultural parameters of music and the creative processes that was going on from the people's perspective. So moving beyond this kind of scholarly realm into the practitioner's realm. What do they actually do? And so when you were talking about these musical styles, and Todd was so good with walking me through the storyline. And so when people talk to me, oftentimes I hear the music in their language, and the story that he was telling, I just heard all of the musical genres that really encapsulated this whole Gennett process. And so a lot of what we were doing was just kind of reading scripts, looking at photos, talking through different scenes, different people's, the life of, that really heartfelt scene with Thomas Andrew Dorsey when his wife dies and his son dies, and what does that mean? What types of palettes do we create? So all of these things matter. It's a host of variables that come into play. It's not just one thing. Every music cue required a different approach.
Right.
So.
And indeed, and I even threw out, okay, Bix Beiderbecke. You were like, give me something else. So I said, well, Bix Beiderbecke, he's on his deathbed. He's struggling with alcoholism. Hoagie Carmichael's there trying to kind of pull him back, and it was just sort of the pathos and the sadness of that. Of a guy watching his best friend die, musically as well as just the heart to heart that these two guys shared in their common experiences at Gennett was just so powerful. And then you just took it and just took off with it, and just so beautifully musically in such a soft and touching way that just really brought home that the whole experience of it, and did it musically in a way that just really brought the history home, I thought.
We are doing a Facebook Live stream of this discussion, and we may have time for one more question if anybody wants to submit one through Facebook to our Facebook Live feed. But we have a question for the two of you from a viewer of this stream in North Vernon, Indiana.
Great.
And says that this viewer wanted to ask both Todd and Tyron, what was the most difficult, daunting part of putting the documentary together?
Boy, oh boy. Trying to come up with a short list of the names, right? Because there's thousands of people that recorded at Gennett, and some not so good, right? But so many powerfully effective, influential artists, right? That recorded there, and trying to sort of narrow it down, and educate people on this with at the same time appreciating the personal stories. It's not just Louis Armstrong's music, like you said, but like you said, it's the context that you have to think about historically, culturally, socially. That has to affect what you do when you're recording this music, right? And to think about okay, now we got to kind of shift to Bix Beiderbecke. Now we have to shift to Charlie Patton, and that's two totally kind of different sounds, and yet musically there are similarities as well. Yes.
Yeah, it seems to me that when I think about the people that we highlighted in the film that you actually chose, like this, it was more so choosing individuals where that the community from which these individuals came from can identify themselves in their specific stories, right? So that's one.
Yeah, exactly.
That was a big challenge. Do we have the individuals that actually represent the broader community, and they could say yes? That's our voice. They can represent, not, of course, they're one experience, but they're representing a collective in a sense, right? Mm-hmm. But then the other thing, I think from a music standpoint, is to stay out of the way.
Yeah, true.
And let Gennett tell the story.
Mm-hmm.
And so my job was to, again, stay out of the way, let Gennett tell the story, but yet be connected some way to drive the story home. So that was a big challenge for me because we wanted to hear Gennett. This is music from Gennett Records.
Well, and in fact, this was originally going to be a 60-minute show, and we had to come back and make it 90 because we just needed to hear the music. You couldn't talk about Chimes, Blues, and Louis Armstrong without hearing Chimes, Blues, and Louis Armstrong. Right? You had to then understand, but musically, so you could hear it as well as learning the history behind it.
Well, we're going to have to wrap up here in another minute or two, but I wanted to ask the two of you one last question here before we do. Again, this is Todd Gould, the producer and director of the new documentary, The Music Makers of Gennett Records, and Dr. Tyron Cooper, who is a 3-time Emmy Award winner and on the faculty here at Indiana University and wrote the music for this documentary. Say somebody has watched this documentary tonight on WTIU, or they're going to see it when we re-air it sometime next week or two, and they're like, wow, that's a really fascinating story. Where should they go next to like dig deeper into Gennett Records?
Sure. Well, you know, the great thing about these recordings is that they are recorded. I mean, you know, it's like we have physical manifestation of those recordings, and so to go to a lot of Gennett collections, certainly, you know, you talk about that on your radio show a lot about hearing that music, which is great. You know, we're doing a partnership with the Archives of Traditional Music here at IU, and they have a huge collection of Gennett recordings. They've got a lot of history, and particularly about Hoagie Carmichael and Mix Beiderbecke and that history as well. So, so those are some places, you know, that you could turn to, as well as a lot of different books and things. I know the website lists a lot of discographies and books and things that you can read as well. Musically, I mean, are there some other good places to turn, or some other people to listen to kind of get the sense of what Gennett's handed out or passed on?
Well, I think, you know, you just mentioned the Archives of Traditional Music, and particularly they have the whole Gennett collection there, right? So you can definitely go and hear that. Of course, when you're thinking about the different genres that Gennett are represented, come to the Archives of African American Music and Culture. You want to hear blues, gospel. So we have a whole, I mean, really right here on Indiana University's campus, just to tell you the whole truth and nothing but the truth, right? You have really the full gamut of these musical styles represented from Gennett Records. So, and I think for those of us who are listening to current musical styles who are kind of ahistorical in our listening, right? Sometimes we don't necessarily know where this stuff comes from. I think this is a perfect place to start right here at Indiana University to kind of peruse the collections that we have in our archival materials.
And what is the WTIU website address?
It's wtiu.org/Gennett, and there's certainly a lot of history about the show itself. There's some great historical listings, bibliographical references, discographies, like I said, certain albums you could pick out, other resources like the Institute of Jazz Studies at Rutgers and Berea College in Kentucky. A lot of these other things that we've sort of pulled from and then pulled together here as a part of the connections with this show. And we're trying to use that show then to sort of branch out to everybody else and say, here are some things that you can learn from, and then if you want to learn more, go to this site and you can go find a ton of other things to read about or listen to.
All right. Well, our guests have been WTIU producer and director of the new documentary, The Music Makers of Gennett Records, Todd Gould, and Dr. Tyron Cooper, a 3-time Emmy Award winner who scored the documentary and is also the chairman of the Archives of African American Music and Culture here at Indiana University. Thank you so much for joining this Facebook Live conversation.